Now, since MATLAB has no explicit types for its variables, there is nothing preventing you from passing single scalar value instead of a vector where a vector is required. For that reason, you can, and more often than not, you should safeguard your functions against this kind of behavior. To do this, you can simply use an if statement in the beginning of your function that will simply check whether the function has the proper arguments or not. So, in our example, we can say if the size of the vector, so if the length of the first vector is different from the length of the second vector, times 2, we want to output an error. So we are going to interrupt everything and we're going to say this function requires vectors of the same size, like this. And so if we run the code now, it's still working, but if I now change the size of one of the two vectors, we get an error. This function requires vectors of the same size. So one issue is fixed, one potential problem. Not only we need our vectors to be of the same size, but we also need them to be vectors, actually vectors, and we need them to be vector rows. So we have to perform a check and see whether the vectors are actually vectors, so they are not matrices. The way to do this, we can now let's leave this as the last check that we're going to do, and here I'm going to have an if. So we are going to use if else if for each of the cases for which we want to safeguard our function. So if the way to check if something is a matrix, we have to check both of its sizes and check whether they are more than 1. So we're going to take size of temps 1, the first size, and we're going to check if it's more than 1. And we are also going to check the second size of temps 1, second dimension. We're going to check if it's also more than 1. And if that is the case, let's add another set of brackets here. All right, if that is the case, we want to throw another error. So error temps 1 is a matrix. We're also going to do the same thing for the second vector. So else if, I'm simply going to copy and paste this condition. So this is temps 2 now. Error temps 2 is a matrix. We need a vector. And we can do the same thing up here. All right. And if we try now, and if we try to give it matrices, so 2 by 7, we get temps 2 is a matrix. We need a vector. If we switch it around, we get temps 1 is a matrix. All right. So it's working. And the final thing that we want to check before we check the length of the vectors is else if these vectors are both row vectors. To check if they are row vectors, we're going to check their second dimension. In order for a vector to be a row vector in MATLAB, its first dimension must be 1. If the second dimension is 1, then we have a row column. So if size of temps 1, the second dimension, is equal to 1, or so if either of these vectors is a column vector, so size temps 2, temps 2, second size is also equal to 1. So error, we need row vectors, like that. Let's try it. So if we switch this to 7 and 1, so we still get vectors with 7 elements, but we get the error. We need row vectors. And you can even take it a step further and say else if, and actually split these two conditions like that. And here we are going to say temps 1 is a column, and here we can say we need row vectors, temps 2 is a column. So we have an individual error for each of these vectors. If we run it now, we will get a specific message saying that the first vector is a column, or if the second vector is a column. But notice that when we get both vectors as columns, we get only the first error. Now let's change this to 1 and to 7, and now we get temps 2. And that is how we safeguarded our function. As you can see, the safeguarding code is even more than the function itself. But now, this function will only work if you give it row vectors of the same size. If you give it different sizes for the vectors, it's not going to work. If you give it matrices, it's not going to work. So this function is now very, very, very specific about what it does.